My son was dead, that's what they told me. That's what I told myself every morning for 6 weeks, standing in the kitchen, pouring coffee I didn't taste, staring out at the backyard where Daniel used to kick a soccer ball against the fence when he was 9 years old. The fence was still there. The scuff marks were still there. My son was not. The memorial service was held on a Tuesday, which felt wrong to me. Daniel had always hated Tuesdays. Said they were the most useless day of the week, not close enough to the weekend to feel hopeful. Not close enough to Monday to feel like a fresh start. But my daughter-in-law Susan had chosen Tuesday, and I didn't argue. I had stopped arguing about most things by then. The venue was a small event hall on the east side of town, the kind of place that hosted retirement parties and baby showers on the weekends and tried very hard to feel solemn on days like this. There were folding chairs arranged in rows and a large photograph of Daniel on an easel near the front his company headshot, the one where he was wearing a navy tie and trying to look more serious than he actually was. I had always thought that photo made him look like a stranger. I sat in the front row and shook hands with people whose names I kept forgetting. Co-workers, neighbors, a few old college friends who had driven in from out of state. Everyone said the same things. What a loss. What a good man. You must be so proud of who he was. I was proud. I am proud. But standing there, listening to people describe my son in the past tense, I felt something that wasn't quite grief. It was more like a wrongness. A low, persistent hum behind everything, like a refrigerator that keeps running in the middle of the night. There was no body. That was the official explanation for why there was no traditional funeral. Daniel's car had been found at the bottom of a ravine off Route 9, doors open, engine still running. The drop was 40 feet into a creek that had been running high from spring runoff. The county divers searched for 4 days. They found his wallet, his phone, one shoe. They did not find Daniel. The detective in charge, a tired-looking woman named Rivas, had explained it to me twice. The current in that section of the creek moved fast. Cases like this, she said, the body sometimes traveled miles before surfacing. Sometimes it didn't surface at all. I had nodded and thanked her and then sat in my car in the police department parking lot for 45 minutes without moving. So there was a memorial service instead of a funeral. A photograph instead of a casket. People saying what a loss instead of lowering anything into the ground. I was standing near the back of the hall, trying to get some air, when the janitor approached me. He was an older man, maybe mid-70s, thin in the way that people get when they've worked physical jobs their whole lives. He was pushing a wide dust mop down the side corridor, the kind of man you don't really notice at an event like this, which I think is exactly why he waited until I was alone. He stopped a few feet from me and looked up. His eyes were steady and very calm. "You're the father," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am," I said. He looked past me toward the main hall, checking something I couldn't see. Then he reached into the front pocket of his work shirt and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it toward me without a word. I took it. It was a single sheet, folded twice. On the outside, in handwriting I did not recognize, were 2 words. "For Harold." "Who gave you this?" I said. "A man," he said. 3 days ago. He paid me to hold on to it until today. Said to give it to the father, and only when no one else was around. He paused. He said you'd know what to do with it. I looked down at the paper in my hand. My fingers felt strange. What did this man look like? The janitor tilted his head slightly. Honestly, he looked like the man in that photograph up front. He nodded toward the easel near the memorial table. Thinner, maybe. Different hair. But the eyes were the same. He went back to pushing his dust mop before I could say another word. I stood there for a moment, the paper in my hand, the hum behind everything getting louder. Then I unfolded it. The handwriting inside was different from the outside. Smaller. Careful. The kind of handwriting a person uses when they want to make sure every letter is legible. Dad, don't react. Please. If you're reading this, the service has started and that means you're safe for now. Do not go home tonight. There is a self-storage facility called Anchor Storage on Millfield Road, about 4 miles east of where you're sitting. Unit 31. The combination on the lock is the year I won the state championship. You know the one. I will explain everything. I promise. Please don't tell Susan. I read it 3 times. My chest felt like something was sitting on it. The year he won the state championship. 2003. His sophomore year of high school. He'd been the youngest starter on the varsity wrestling team, and he'd pinned the defending champion from Westbrook in the final match and cried in the parking lot afterward because he hadn't expected to win. I had stood there and put my arm around his shoulders and told him it was all right to cry. He said he knew that. He cried anyway. I folded the paper and put it in the inside pocket of my jacket, directly over my heart, which was beating faster than it had any business beating for a man my age. Across the room, Susan was speaking with Daniel's former supervisor. She was composed and gracious and wearing a black dress I had never seen before. She caught my eye across the room and gave me a small, tight smile. The kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. The kind that said, "I see you," without saying anything else. My phone buzzed. I looked down. It was a text from Susan. "Harold, are you staying for the reception? It would mean a lot to have you here." I typed back that I would try. Then I stood there and looked at my daughter-in-law across the room and felt something cold move through me that I didn't entirely understand. I slipped out through the side door at 3:15. The drive to Millfield Road took me through a part of town I didn't know well, industrial blocks, a couple of warehouses, a tire shop with a hand-painted sign. Anchor Storage sat at the end of a long gravel drive behind a chain-link fence. The gate was propped open with a cinder block, the kind of place that didn't ask too many questions. I drove in slowly, my headlights cutting across rows of corrugated metal doors. Unit numbers were stenciled in white paint above each door. I found 31 near the far end of the second row, tucked between 30 and 32 like it was trying not to be noticed. There was a combination padlock on the latch. I turned the dial with fingers that were not entirely steady. 2. 0. 0. 3. The lock opened. I pulled the door up. It rolled on its tracks with a sound like a slow exhale. The unit was not empty. There was a cot against the left wall, neatly made. A folding table with a camping lantern on it, a box of crackers, 2 water bottles, a duffel bag in the corner. A small battery-powered space heater, switched off. And on the folding table, leaning against the lantern, a sealed envelope with my name on it. Same handwriting as the note from the janitor. I stepped inside. The gravel crunched under my shoes. The air smelled like concrete and cold metal. I picked up the envelope and turned it over. Sealed with tape, not licked. I opened it. Inside was a letter. 4 pages, front and back. I carried the folding table outside where the late afternoon light was better, and I sat down on an overturned plastic crate, and I read every word. My son had not died. He had watched someone die, and that had started everything. 14 months earlier, Daniel had been working late in the accounting department of his company, a mid-sized logistics firm called Crestline, one of those businesses that sounds boring and turns out to be anything but. He had been trying to reconcile a set of figures that didn't add up. Invoices for freight contracts with vendors that didn't appear to exist. He had pulled the thread, the way careful people do, and the thread had led somewhere he hadn't expected. The company's CFO, a man named Patrick Greer, had been running a systematic fraud for nearly 6 years, moving money through shell companies, skimming from federal contracts, laundering funds through accounts in 2 different states. The numbers Daniel found totaled somewhere north of $11 million. Daniel had made 2 mistakes in close succession. The first was telling his direct supervisor what he'd found before telling anyone else. The second was not realizing his supervisor was one of the people who already knew. Within a week, Daniel had been approached. Not by the police, by 2 men he did not know, in a parking garage, at 10 o'clock at night. They were very polite. They explained that he had found some documents he wasn't supposed to find, and that the best thing for everyone being a word they used with deliberate emphasis, was for Daniel to forget what he'd seen and keep coming to work and never mention it again. Daniel had agreed. And then he had gone home and stayed up all night and called the FBI field office in the morning. The agent he spoke to, a woman named Carver, had been direct with him. Yes, Crestline was already under investigation. Yes, the evidence Daniel had was significant. Yes, testifying could mean a real outcome for a case they had been building for 3 years. And yes, there were risks. Greer had connections. The 2 men in the parking garage were not independent contractors. The case had to be handled carefully. For 6 months, Daniel had been cooperating quietly, passing documents, recording conversations, going to work every day, and acting like a man who had forgotten everything he'd seen. Then, 2 months ago, something changed. The letter didn't say exactly what. Daniel wrote only that Agent Carver had called him on a Saturday morning and told him that his name had surfaced in a way it shouldn't have, that a source inside the investigation had been compromised, and that they had a narrow window to do something that would protect both the case and Daniel's family. They gave him 72 hours. He had packed 1 bag. He had kissed Susan and their daughter goodnight, told them he had a work trip. He had driven to a location the FBI arranged. He had not gone home after that. The accident, the car in the ravine, the open doors, the 1 shoe had been staged. Not perfectly. Not with a lot of resources. Just carefully enough to give it the appearance of a terrible accident in a remote spot, the kind that produces no body and no clear answers. Enough to buy time. Enough to make the men who had approached Daniel in that parking garage believe that the problem had solved itself. The FBI had moved Daniel to a temporary location, somewhere he didn't name in the letter. They were building toward an indictment. It was taking longer than expected because the case was larger than expected. Greer's network extended further than the original investigation had known. Daniel wrote that he had fought for months to find a way to contact me. Just me. Not Susan, and here the letter slowed down, the handwriting getting more deliberate, each word chosen carefully. Susan, he wrote, was not aware of any of it. He was certain of that. He trusted her. But the people watching the family had flagged her phone and her email, and Agent Carver had been clear. No contact with the immediate household. Any message sent there could be intercepted. Any visit could be traced back to Daniel's location. He had found the janitor through a circuitous chain that the letter described only vaguely. A contact who knew a contact. Someone who could be trusted to hold an envelope for 3 days without opening it. He had chosen the memorial service because it was the one event where I would be present in a public place, watched by enough people that anything unusual would be noticed, but also large enough that one quiet exchange in a side corridor could go unremarked. He had not wanted me to come to a memorial service for him. He wrote that 3 times in slightly different ways, and I could feel the difficulty of it in each sentence. He wrote, "I know this has been the worst thing I have ever done to you. I know there is no way to make it right except to come back. I am trying to come back." He wrote, "Don't go home tonight. Stay somewhere else. I don't think you're in danger. But I don't want to be wrong about that. Give it 1 night." He wrote, "I love you, Dad. I'm sorry. I hope someday this makes sense." At the bottom of the last page, in smaller letters, as if he had added it after finishing the rest, "The cot is clean. There's a good lock on the unit. If you want to stay here tonight instead of a hotel, you're welcome to it. I picked this place because I knew you'd find it, and I knew it was safe. I thought maybe it would feel better than being alone somewhere you don't know." I sat on the overturned crate in the fading afternoon light outside Unit 31 of Anchor Storage on Millfield Road, and I held those 4 pages, and I did not move for a long time. The first thing I felt was not relief, it was anger, and it surprised me with how clean and immediate it was. 6 weeks. 6 weeks of coffee I didn't taste, and backyard fences, and a detective named Rivas, and a folding chair at a memorial service for a living man. 6 weeks of trying to learn how to be a person who had outlived his child, which is the most unnatural thing in the world, the thing that rewrites who you are at the most fundamental level, and he had been alive. He had been in a room somewhere, eating food, breathing, sleeping, alive. I was angry for several minutes, and I let myself be angry, and then the anger shifted, the way weather shifts. and underneath it was something else entirely, something quieter and harder to name. He had done this to keep us safe, not to disappear, not to run. He had walked into a federal investigation, spent 6 months documenting a fraud that powerful people wanted buried, and when they came for him, he had made himself a ghost, specifically so that the people who might come looking would have no reason to look in our direction. He had made himself dead so that we could stay alive and unbothered and unaware. I thought about the night he was born, 3 a.m, a February that had dropped below 0. His mother, my wife, gone 8 years now, had gripped my hand hard enough to leave marks, and Daniel had arrived in the world looking furious about it, red-faced and loud. And I had thought, here is a person. Here is a whole person, and I am responsible for him. I thought about all the years between that moment and this one. The scuff marks on the fence, the wrestling championship, the navy tie in the headshot, the careful handwriting that said, "I love you, Dad." I folded the letter and put it in my jacket pocket next to the first note. I went back into the unit and sat on the edge of the cot and looked at the camping lantern and the box of crackers, and I thought about my son choosing this place because he wanted me to feel safe. He had thought about me being alone. He had thought about where I might go and what I might need, and he had tried to provide for it even from wherever he was, even from a location he couldn't name. That was not the behavior of a man who had abandoned his father. That was the behavior of a man who loved his father and was doing the best he could inside a situation that had no clean exits. I stayed in Unit 31 that night. It was not comfortable. The cot was adequate, and the space heater took the edge off the cold, and I ate 4 crackers and 2 handfuls of the trail mix I found at the bottom of the duffel bag, which turned out to be Daniel's full of the clothes of a man who had packed for somewhere indefinite. I didn't open the bag any further than that. It felt like reading someone's mail. I lay on the cot in the dark, and I thought about the question I couldn't answer. How long? How long would this go on? The letter hadn't said. Agent Carver hadn't been in contact with me, didn't even know I knew any of this. The indictment was coming, Daniel had written, but coming was a word that covered a lot of distance. I thought about Susan, home with their daughter. Going to bed that night not knowing that the phone and the email were being watched, not knowing that her husband was alive, not knowing anything except that she had organized a memorial service and shaken 100 hands and worn a black dress she had apparently bought for the occasion. I didn't know what to think about Susan. Daniel had said he trusted her. I wanted to trust her too, but I kept coming back to that text message. It would mean a lot to have you here. And the smile that didn't reach her eyes. Maybe I was wrong about the smile. Maybe grief just looks like that sometimes. Somewhere around 2 a.m, I stopped trying to solve things I didn't have enough information to solve, and I closed my eyes and I listened to the distant sound of traffic on the highway, and I thought, he is alive. Whatever else is true, he is alive. I know it now in a way I didn't know it this morning. Hold on to that, I told myself. The rest can come later. I slept eventually. Better than I expected. In the morning, I drove to a diner 3 miles away and ordered eggs and coffee and sat at the counter for an hour. The waitress refilled my cup without being asked. The news was on a television mounted in the corner, local traffic, a city council vote, the weather. Nothing that touched me. I had one decision to make, whether to reach out to Agent Carver directly. Daniel hadn't told me to do that. He hadn't told me not to. The letter had been about keeping me safe for one night and making sure I understood what had happened. It wasn't a plan. It was a message from a man who missed his father and needed him to know the truth. I paid for my eggs and sat in the car in the diner parking lot and thought about it for a long time. Then I drove home. Not because it was necessarily safe. Because I was 64 years old and I had slept on a cot in a storage unit and I needed a shower and clean clothes and my own bed, and because I had decided that whatever was watching my house was probably not watching it for me. I was the father. I was adjacent to the story. I was not the story. Nothing happened when I got home. The mail was in the box. The neighbors were walking their dog. The scuff marks were on the fence. I found Agent Carver 3 days later. Not through the local FBI field office. I had enough sense not to call a general number. I found her through a method that took patience and some careful asking around, starting with a lawyer I had used years ago for an estate matter. A man who knew people, which is how most things actually work in this world. She called me on a Friday evening from a number I didn't recognize. She didn't confirm anything on that call. She asked me several questions, carefully worded, the kind that were designed to let her understand how much I knew without giving her any information in return. I answered them honestly. At the end, she said, "You did the right thing reaching out." I asked her how much longer. There was a pause. "We're close," she said. "A few more weeks. Maybe less. Is he all right?" Another pause, shorter this time. "He's all right." I thanked her, and she ended the call, and I sat in the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water and stood at the window looking out at the yard. It was a Thursday morning in April, 4 weeks after that phone call, when my cell phone rang with a number I didn't know. I picked it up because I had been picking up every unknown number for months. Dad. The voice was thinner than I remembered. Quieter, but it was his. I sat down because my legs were not reliable. "Daniel," I said. "It's over," he said. "Greer took a plea this morning. The whole thing is done. They said. I can come home." I didn't say anything for a moment. I was looking at the scuff marks on the fence through the kitchen window, the same scuff marks I had looked at every morning for months, and I was thinking about a 9-year-old boy kicking a soccer ball. "Where are you?" I said. "About 4 hours away. I'll drive. I wanted to call you first. Before Susan. Before anyone. I needed you to know first." "Come home," I said. "Dad, I'm sorry. I've been trying to figure out how to say that in a way that's enough, and I don't think there is a way." "Come home," I said again. "We'll talk when you get here. Drive carefully." He arrived in the early evening. I heard the car in the driveway, and I was at the door before he reached the porch. He looked different, thinner, like the janitor had said, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. He was carrying a single bag over one shoulder. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at me. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Then he came up the steps, and I put both arms around my son and held on to him the way I hadn't let myself hold on to the memory of him, because the memory was just memory, and this was real. This was actual weight and warmth. This was a person. He said, into my shoulder, that he was sorry. I said, I knew. He said he hadn't wanted any of it to go the way it went. I said I knew that too. After a while, we went inside and sat at the kitchen table, and I made coffee that actually tasted like something for the first time in months. He told me the parts the letter hadn't covered, the weeks in a rented room outside a small town in Kentucky, the calls with Agent Carver, the waiting that had no fixed end point. He told me he had thought about me every day. I believed him. He called Susan from my kitchen, and I sat at the table and listened to the sound of his voice explaining the inexplicable to his wife, and I heard the silence on his end that meant she was crying, and I heard him say, I know, I know. I know, over and over in the patient way you speak to someone who needs time to absorb something enormous. They had a long road ahead of them. That was true, and I knew it. A man disappearing from his family for months, even for the right reasons, even with people protecting him, leaves marks that don't vanish because the reasons turn out to be good. Trust has its own timeline, and love doesn't exempt you from the work. But they had a road. That was the thing. Before the letter in the storage unit, before Unit 31 and the camping lantern and the box of crackers, I had been trying to learn how to grieve the end of something. And the thing about grief, the specific grief of losing a child, is that it doesn't just take the person, it takes the future. Every future conversation, every holiday, every phone call that starts with just checking in. It takes the version of yourself that exists in relation to that person. He had given all of that back. Not cleanly, not without damage. Not in a way I would have chosen, or that he would have chosen. I thought about what I'd felt lying on that cot in the dark, listening to highway traffic, holding the knowledge of a living son. I thought about the decision he had made not to run from something, but to stay inside it long enough to help bring it down, and to take the shape of a dead man rather than let the people threatening him have any reason to look in our direction. He was not a perfect man. He had made mistakes before the parking garage and after it. He would make more. We all do, everyone who lives long enough. But he had been given a choice between his own safety and ours, and he had chosen ours without hesitation and without asking for anything in return except that I not go home for one night and then that I understand someday. There is a particular kind of love that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come wrapped in the right words or the right timing. It comes in the form of hard choices made quietly, in the form of sacrifice that looks, from the outside, like abandonment. It asks you to trust it without being able to explain itself. The hardest part is that you don't know what you're looking at until you're on the other side of it. I sat across the kitchen table from my living son, and I thought about all the mornings I had stood at this window, looking at those scuff marks and trying to understand how a man continues after something like that. Now I understood the answer. You continue by finding out you were wrong. And if you're lucky, and I know I was lucky, you find out in a storage unit on a Tuesday evening with a letter in your hands and a camping lantern on a folding table and the handwriting of someone who never stopped thinking about you. The coffee was good, the kitchen was warm, my son was home. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.